We've been discussing the Heter Mechira, and fundamentally there were two halachic problems with the procedure itself. Halachic problem number one is, does it even work? Meaning to say, who says just because the land of Israel belongs to a non-Jew, you're allowed to cultivate it during shemitah? Many opinions say that even Rav Yosef Karo that says that the produce of grown by Goyim does not have the sanctity of shemitah, but they say the land does retain kedusha, which means, in other words, you've accomplished nothing. Yeah, the land belongs to a guy, but so what? The Jewish farmer is still transgressing all the laws of shemitah. So that's halachic issue number one, meaning who says the sale accomplishes anything? Please remember that, because that's a very important consideration. Halachic issue number two is, even if we assume it does accomplish something, it is a sinful act that you're not allowed to do because of the negative commandment of lo sechanem, not giving a non-Jew residence or permanence or ownership of land in the land of Israel. All right, so these are two separate issues. Issue number one is, does the sale accomplish its goal? Issue number two, even if it does accomplish its goal, are you permitted to do it? Now, there is an issue number three, which is brought up a lot, and it is essentially a fake issue. And that is, a lot of people bring up the idea, oh, it's a joke, it's not serious, the farmer knows that it's really his land, therefore it's not a real sale. That's issue number three. Problem is, this is identically to chametz. Chametz works exactly the same way, and if you're going to start telling me it's a trick, it's a fake, it's an evasion, nobody takes it seriously, then you wouldn't be able to sell your chametz. So I'm not even going to pursue that. Now, there are people, again, I can respect consistency. There are people who refuse to sell their chametz. All right, so if somebody says, I'm not going to sell my chametz because it's a fake sale, which it isn't, but they say it is, all right, then I can understand them saying, I'm not going to rely on selling the land to the guy because it's a fake sale. Okay, you want to go there, you can go there. But you cannot possibly defend selling chametz and then attack selling land to the guy. If anything, chametz is a much more severe prohibition because the ownership of chametz during Pesach is a Torah violation for sure. According to most opinions, as we will see, shemitah bisman hazeh is rabbanan. And if it's midrabanan, we're certain to make. All right, so the three objections that are raised, I'm going to throw out the third one, but I'll mention it. Objection one, which is a very significant objection, that even if you sell land to a guy, that does not permit a Jewish farmer to work the land. Objection number two, it is sinful to sell land to a guy. Those two are very weighty objections. Objection three, nobody takes it seriously. My answer to that is, well, if you take chametz seriously, you can take this seriously. There's really no difference. Yeah.
Just on the third point, with regards to I know with regards to selling chametz, you can make some sort of stipulations, sort of limiting the access for the goy to get to the object. Can you do the same thing with
Yeah, same thing. And if the guy wants to take the land at the end of shemitah, he'll have to pay $10 billion or something. Same thing. So, okay, but I don't want to get myself into politics. But those who are so vociferous about fake sales, a lot of that is political because they do it for chametz. But again, just because I think taina number three is not valid, please do not dismiss tainas 1 and 2. Tainas 1 and 2 are very valid halachic arguments. Again, we'll talk about what Rav Kook does for those. So part of the argument number three, again, maybe I'm getting in trouble, maybe I shouldn't do this if I'm speaking to the public. Okay, I always know that. So I will get my hate mail. But argument number three is political. I think it's worthless. Objections 1 and 2 are significant tainas on the legitimacy of the Heter Mechira. Now again, what does Rav Kook say about arguments 1 and 2? So number one, Rav Kook argues that if you follow Rav Yosef Karo, that ownership of a goy takes away the holiness of the peiros, that would also mean it takes away the holiness of the land. Therefore, he would allow the Jew to work on the land. And with respect to the second argument, that is it not prohibited to sell land to a non-Jew? So I mentioned yesterday that Rav Kook gives a number of possible answers. Answer one is the Isser only applies to idolaters, of the avodah zarah, not to just stam non-Jews. And Islam the Arab buyer is a monotheist. That's argument number one. Argument number two, it only applies to a permanent sale, and this is a temporary sale. And argument number three, it only applies if you're diluting the Jewish presence in the land of Israel, but a sale to a non-Jew that will enhance the Jewish settlement and the Jewish presence is fakert. The other way around, it's not a violation of giving them encampment. It is a fulfillment of increasing the Jewish presence. These are Rav Kook's three answers to the prohibition aspect. But again, let me point out that many Gedolei Yisrael do not accept those answers. So this is a live machlokas. There's no reason for this to be a political controversy. There's no reason for this to be a controversy between Haredi, Dati, Leumi, like what is your philosophy of life? What is your philosophy of Zionism? This is a halachic dispute. And there are proofs both ways in all directions, and like anything else, it can and should be addressed as a halachic dispute, not an ideological one. Ideology should have no relevance to this. Yeah?
Does the Gra have any place where he talks about the Mechira or anything? Because I know in regards to selling chametz, he wasn't a fan of selling chametz. I don't know if the same idea would apply by
the Gra does not directly address Heter Mechira simply because it wasn't really done in his time. But one would imagine if you're against chametz, you might be against that for the third objection. Now, here is the thing. I want to point out another thing. There's a certain foundational argument that is the basis of all of Rav Kook's leniencies. And that is the fact that according to most opinions, the observance of shemitah is midrabanan today. Now, we went over this last week. Let me go over this again. The mitzvah of shemitah is, of course, in the Torah. It's in the Torah, right? You can't deny that. But you'll recall that Yovel is also in the Torah, the Jubilee year. And you'll also recall that we don't keep the Jubilee year today. And not only don't we keep it today, but we didn't keep it in the second Beis HaMikdash. And we didn't even keep it in the last 100 years of the first Beis HaMikdash. Because there's a Gezeras HaKosov of Yovel, that the Yovel only applies when most of the Jews, maybe all of the Jews, but at least most of the Jews, are living in the land of Israel. And number two, in their tribal allocations. And ever since the exile of the lost 10 tribes, which to this day have not been fully united with us, we have not had most of the Jews living in the land of Israel. So the whole Second Temple period, you did not have most of the Jews living in the land of Israel. And even if people say demographically we're going to hit the 51% mark, which is, again, a big question, we don't have tribal allocations. So as a result, there is no Yovel. That's for sure, right? We don't keep Yovel today. But many Rishonim say that Yovel and Shemitah walk hand in hand. And when there's no Yovel, that itself means there's no Shemitah. And if that's the case, the reason we keep Shemitah is only a rabbinic enactment. Now, Tosos and Gittin asked the kasha, well, if the rabbis enacted Shemitah, why didn't they enact Yovel rabbinically? I mean, why not? Why don't we have Yovel d'Rabbanan? So Tosos gives a very fascinating answer. He says, because the rabbis did not want to give you 2 years in a row where you couldn't work the land. Think about this. Yovel is the 50th year. The year before a Yovel is always a Shemitah year. It's the year 49 in a 50-year cycle. Now, you're not allowed to work the land on Shemitah. You're not allowed to work the land on Yovel. If the rabbis would bring back Yovel as well as Shemitah, you wouldn't be able to cultivate the land year 49 and year 50. That would have been too much of a hardship. So they brought back Shemitah. They didn't bring back Yovel. Yeah.
kind of, I mean, it's either you can or you can't. You say because it's difficult to have the two. Is that what the Torah envisaged that it would be difficult?
No. Okay, that's a very good question. So keep in mind that from the perspective of the Torah, which indeed would have these 2 years, God gave you a special blessing that you'll have extra grain the year before. But some say that special blessing only applies when the Torah commands you to do it. When the rabbis command you to do it, you're not going to have that special blessing, and therefore the rabbis could take into account hardship when deciding how far they should make their rabbinic enactments. Now, so it does turn out, according to most opinions, the observance of shemitah today is a rabbinic observance and not a Torah observance. Now, for the most part, that doesn't make a difference. So what? Just because it's rabbinic, I have to keep it. It's part of the halachic system. But Rav Kook points out that when you have debatable arguments in halacha and the underlying commandment is a rabbinic commandment, there may be grounds to follow the more lenient interpretations of halacha because shemitah is rabbanan. So even though Rav Kook's point about the ownership of the goy taking away the holiness of the land is a debatable point, and even if Rav Kook's heter of lo sechane might be a debatable point, we might allow it when the underlying point of shemitah is d'Rabbanan. I might not have allowed this if shemitah would be d'oraisa, but we might allow it if shemitah is d'Rabbanan. Now, fascinating, I had mentioned the other day that Rav Kook did not invent the Heter Mechira. The Heter Mechira was utilized by Sephardic Rabbanim in the early Moshavot in the 1880s, before Rav Kook even came to Eretz Yisrael. And this was widely discussed by the European Gedolim as well. Rav Yitzchak Elchanan, again I'm reviewing some of the names, who was the posek of the door, actually legitimated the form of the Heter Mechira. On the other hand, the Nitziv and the Beis Halevi did not. They considered it to be prohibited. So I want to just bring to your attention a fascinating little vort of the Beis Halevi, which seems not to be la halacha, but he uses it to undermine Rav Kook's point that since shemitah is d'Rabbanan, we can be more lenient. He says, shemitah might be d'Rabbanan, but it gets upgraded to a doraisa in the following way. In the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah describes the Jews returning to Eretz Yisrael after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. And they built a second, only a minority, and they built a second Beis HaMikdash. And in the book of Nehemiah, it is discussed that on the 24th of Tishrei, this is around 14 years after the Beis HaMikdash was built, Ezra and Nehemiah convened. Ezra was very, very old and more or less in retirement, but he came out of seclusion. Nehemiah was the active political, religious leader. He gathered all the Jews together for something that's called the Amana. The Amana is the covenant of faithfulness to God. It was kind of a mass tshuva rally where people took an oath to live by the Torah. Very dramatic scene. There was like a constitution that was read, a document that was read. It was signed by 85 leaders. And then the whole crowd, how many people? Thousands and thousands of people, swore allegiance. It was almost like a mini Matan Torah. This is called the Amana, the covenant of faith. So it mentions a number of specific areas in which the Jewish people took an oath. Not to intermarry, to keep Shabbos, and it mentions they took an oath to keep shemitah. Now here's the Beis Halevi's chap. It is true that at that time the observance of shemitah was only rabbinic because there was no Yovel. But once they took an oath to keep shemitah, since breaking an oath is a Torah violation under the Ten Commandments, so as a result, violating shemitah now becomes d'oraisa, not because of shemitah, but because of the oath of the Amana. Now the problem is, of course, we didn't take that oath. It was an earlier generation. Is the Beis Halevi suggesting that an intergenerational oath can be binding on future generations? Well, in some ways, Matan Torah itself had that status of an intergenerational oath. But this is the Beis Halevi's chap, so to speak. His chap is that even if shemitah in its inception today is a rabbinic ordinance, by virtue of the shavua of the Amana, it now gets upgraded to a doraita. So any leniency based on shemitah being drabanan, the Beis Halevi says is misguided, because the Amana is going to make it a doraita. Again, that's a big chiddush, and the truth of the matter is, the poskim do not seem to accept that. There are a number of other leniencies we're not going to discuss where we do use the idea of shemitah drabanan as a leniency, and we don't make the argument that because of the shavua of the Amana, it gets upgraded to a deraisa. Yeah.
Can I understand the comparison to Matan Torah? But the only difference is that at Matan Torah, every single Jew of the nation was there. So at this point in time, wasn't it the case that you had Jews in Babel?
Yep, that is a very good point. By definition, you did not have a majority of Jews in the land of Israel. So the shvua of the Amana was only, well, it was a majority of the Jews in Israel, but there was only a minority of the Jewish world. So even if you go with the notion of intergenerational oath by the nation becomes binding on the nation, here you actually did not have the nation. But it could be, and this is actually a lashon of the Rambam, that in defining Am Yisrael, defining the Jewish community, we look at the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. They, in other words, if a majority of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael take a certain step, that is called a majority of the nation. The Rambam actually says such an idea. Yeah.
Two questions. Firstly, surely Hator's Cedar would allow the oath that we took around the time of the family.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is no oath. And secondly, if by Purim time, which was after the second Beis Hamikdash, if I'm not mistaken, then we say that we reaccepted the Torah. So
Yeah.
it's like a fresh start.
Yeah. So first of all, let me just correct the second thing you said. The Purim story was before the building of the second Beis Hamikdash. In fact, the Persian king under whose rule the second Beis Hamikdash was built was Darius II, who was the child that Esther had with Achashverosh. So the story of Purim is at the very end of the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are after the story of Purim. Okay, but in terms of your first point, HaTorah Stedarim, you are correct, but nevertheless, it is brought down that when the oaths are made by a whole congregation as a solemn commitment, those oaths are not annullable. They are not cancelable by a Torah Stedarim. There are a whole category of vows and oaths that cannot be canceled. Yeah.
You said that the Sephardic rabbinate during the time of the Ottoman Empire, were in favor of.
Well, some. I'm not going to say a general rule, but there were Sephardic rabbis who authorized the farmers to sell them.
Is the composition of the Jewish Nation today, or Sephardic committee in general?
No. This was not. This was done by individual rabbanim who were the local rabbis of the moshavot, of the agricultural settlements. There was not really a centralized rabbinate at that particular point.
If Rabbi, would he be against it?
Well, it happens to be, okay, well, we'll talk about it. It happens to be that Rav Ovadia was actually a very big supporter of the Heter Mechira. Now, you could trace it to the Sephardic heritage, but he came to it on his own independent grounds. But it does happen to be that Rav Ovadia was very annoyed with the rejection in the Haredi world of the Heter Mechira. So that is true, yeah.
Yitzchak was the first one to discuss the topic.
Who?
Yitzchak was the first one to discuss the topic.
Not the first. I mean, not the first one, but the first lengthy tshuva is Rav Yitzchak Elchanan. Yeah. But again, I do want to point out again that all of the tshuvas did emphasize the starvation and the economic deprivation conditions. I mean, that was always a major factor, and. You don't change halacha necessarily because of that, but when you have different views and you're deciding which views you have to follow, so this is certainly going to be a major consideration in deliberations.
Why did they come up with this idea at the times of the Yosef also?
Why did they what?
Why did they come up with this idea at the times of the Yosef?
Well, the problem was that there was really not much of a need in the time of the Yosef. I mean, very, very few Jews did own land, so the Beis Yosef and the Mabit were dealing with all the farmers were goyim, so it wasn't a major issue, yeah.
And I'm not sure it's got the same kind of weighting of the rabbanon and Doraita, but I'm just something that's crossing my mind is about Pesach. We keep certain customs that maybe aren't with regard to you notice this here with regard to like corn and certain things that the practices change, but we still keep. Whereas could you not apply that logic to the Heter Mechira to say, well, yes, that applied then, but we still keep it because we don't change it.
Well, okay, first of all, there is a difference between being strict and being lenient, meaning to say, it's one thing to say, if we adopted a certain custom to be strict, then we don't have the authority to abrogate it. On the other hand, a custom or a law that was adopted because of extenuating circumstances, we lose our justification to depart from it. Now, just for general information, you're referring to what's called kitnios. Kitnios are rice, corn, legumes, and this is one of the great divides between many Ashkenazim, virtually all Ashkenazim and many Sephardim, whether you can eat rice, right? I always say a person decides, a person is a Baal Tshuva or a Ger, and they can decide if they want to be Ashkenazi or Sephardi. So you got to make a list. Okay, Sephardi, I get to eat rice on Pesach, corn, whatever it is. So that's good. That's a check mark for the Sephardi. Sephardi has to get up early in the morning for a whole month for slichos. That I think is a negative. Sephardi can have 2 wives. That can go either way, So I don't know about that one, right? So you go through the list and you determine that a ger certainly has freedom to affiliate with any Ada they want, and some say even a Baal Tshuva has a certain freedom to do that, because you're not bound by what your great-grandfather did. If you were not raised in a religious family, you can kind of choose which Ada. So people are discussing at various times. There is some discussion in Israel, mainly among left-wing Orthodox, whether we have the authority to abrogate the kitniot restrictions. But you are correct, most reputable poskim say that we're bound by it. It's become a tradition among Ashkenazim, and we don't have the authority to abrogate it. But that's an example of a stringency. Right. And then, of course, kitnios, the problem is that the category of kitnios tends to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Rav Moshe Feinstein actually writes that when he was a child in Russia, obviously Ashkenazi, he was a child in Russia, they used to get peanuts for a special Pesach treat. In other words, people ate peanuts on Pesach. It was not considered to be any type of problem. Now, in my life, I don't remember people eating peanuts, but I absolutely remember kosher LePesach peanut oil that was certified for Ashkenazim. But if you check over the past 20, 30, maybe 40 years, both peanuts and peanut oil have been reclassified as kitnios and eliminated. So there is no kosher LePesach peanut oil for Ashkenazim. I mean, for Sephardim, whatever, they can have whatever they want. But for Ashkenazim, so kitnios gets expanded. And another major issue is quinoa. Right? Quinoa is Quinoa. It's not quinoa, it's quinoa. And quinoa is, again, it's from South America, so it did not exist in the time of the Gaonim. And there's a very, very live machlokas. Many poskim in the United States do consider quinoa permissible on Pesach. On the other hand, most of the Mahadran Hashgachos here treat quinoa as kitnios. So one interesting issue is, should kitnios be expanded by any type of grain-like product, or do you limit it to the defined categories? Of course, the truth of the matter is, in a way, it's almost illogical that corn should be kitnios. Corn also. Corn is a Native American grain, or whatever it is, legume. And corn did not exist. So rice existed, but corn did not exist in the time of the Gonim. So if you look at kitnios as whatever existed at the time of the minhag, and that's what it is, and we don't expand it by adding new things, then logically even corn shouldn't be kitnios. And yet I think corn is makubal by everybody who doesn't eat kitnios, that you don't eat kitnios. By the way, nice story just about Eretz Yisrael, how Ashkenazim and Sephardim can live together. I was reading a story about Aliyah, people who say, what's so great about living in Israel, why they want to live in Israel. So the person said a story that Chol HaMoed Pesach, they went to a movie. Okay, good or bad, I'm not going to endorse that. But they went to a movie, and to their dismay, they saw a kid selling popcorn in the theater. And they said, oh, this secular country, and Pesach, they violate all the halachas. And when somebody, but then she overheard, the woman overheard, that when somebody wanted to ask for popcorn, the kid said, are you Sephardi or Ashkenazi? They would only sell the popcorn to a Sephardi. They would not sell it to an Ashkenazi. So she said, Mi ka'amcha Yisrael, that popcorn in a movie theater, the kid is still concerned that people should keep their proper minhagim. Yeah.
I've heard that the reason why we don't eat giraffe today, even though it's kosher, and we do know how to slaughter
Don't eat what today?
giraffe.
Giraffe, yeah.
Even though we do know how to slaughter it, because our ancestors in Israel didn't eat it at the time, we don't eat it. You just pointed out that with corn, that's in Native America and in South America, some of these foods. So why is it that we are allowed to eat corn and all of these?
Yeah. So, well, it's very, very clear that the issue of mesorah, that you only eat things that have a tradition of being eaten, only applies to animals that are subject to the laws of kashrus. Since fruits and vegetables, no matter what they are kosher, so by definition, you don't need a tradition to be able to eat a fruit or a grain or a vegetable. You only need a tradition to eat animals, because animals potentially could be non-kosher animals. If we don't have a tradition, we're not 100% sure. So there would never be a problem with a newly discovered, putting aside truma and meiser, but in terms of kashrus, there would never be an issue of a newly discovered vegetable that I have to have some tradition. In fact, I'll tell you the truth, it's very problematical why there would have to be a mesorah for a giraffe. I'll tell you why. The concept that you can only eat things for which there's a tradition, that originated with respect to birds. And the reason is because birds in the Torah are not given kosher signs. There's a list of birds you're not allowed to eat. So we're not sure what they are, etc. So the concept is I shouldn't eat a bird unless it was accepted traditionally as being kosher. But with respect to land animals, I have a sign. If it chews its cud and has split hoofs. So even if I discover a totally unknown animal that chews its cud and has split hoofs, what's the problem? Why do I need a mesorah on an animal that has simanim of kashrus? But you are correct. Poskim over the years have been machmir even on that, and they have said you need a mesorah. But technically, the concept of mesorah originated for birds. And as I said, it certainly has no application to fruits and vegetables, which bichlal don't have any simanim that say they have to be kosher a certain way. Yeah.
So if you could eat a turkey cold performer, you obviously could eat a giraffe. It's a bird.
Yeah. Well, you're correct. There are. Yes. Now, people sometimes say, I heard as a kid, and a lot of people I've heard it since, they say a giraffe is a kosher animal, split hoofs, chews its cud, but because the neck is so long, we don't know where to shecht it properly. You're going to hear that a lot. That is absolutely an incorrect reason, because the point is you can shecht anywhere along the neck. If the giraffe has a long neck, that doesn't mean you don't know where to shecht it. You can shecht it anywhere on its neck, so that wouldn't be the problem. Now, I will say it is highly dangerous to try to shecht a giraffe. So it could very well be that there is a safety hazard that is involved, and I am told that the meat is extremely tough. So it's not really something that there's a great demand for, but technically it is a kosher animal. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard just because of a practical reason, because the meat tastes very bad and it's very expensive.
Well, yeah. Well, the shochem have to have very high insurance policies. Yeah.
For example, you only need a mesorah on behema, on a chaya, not on a behema.
On an ophos need a mesorah. That's correct. Ophos need a mesorah because the Torah does not give you direct simanim of ophos. In fact, Turkey. There's a big shaila about Turkey, right? Because Turkey again is a North American bird. Jews didn't know about it till they got here in whatever the 1600s and the like. And there were families in Russia that had a tradition they would not eat turkey because it was not something for which there had been an unbroken tradition. I understand that Rav Shechter of YU, at least personally, does not eat turkey, although I don't think he requires his family to keep that particular chumrah. Our defense, why do we eat turkey? Because there is a concept, if it's close enough to a mesorah bird, and turkey, chicken, there can even be cross-hybridization, etc. So we kind of don't need a direct mesorah when it is close enough to a bird for which we do have a direct mesorah. A few years ago, there was even a shaila whether our chickens are within the mesorah. Chickens have been crossbred, they've been combined with other species, there's been a lot of genetic engineering. For chickens, chickens today are bigger than they were, but it's not only because of diet and being fattened, it's because of crossbreeding with other birds. It's a very complicated process. And there was some big discussion. Baruch Hashem, the psak was lenient, but there were people who were beginning to say that, maybe all of the chickens we have not only don't have a mesorah, but actually might be interbred with non-kosher birds. And as a result, chickens would be treifed. This was a whole discussion. It was called the Chicken Wars. This was around 5 years ago. And although we are lenient, but some of the halachic issues are not as clearly, I don't want to make anybody anxious, but we're not as clearly resolved as you might think, right? So everything in Judaism can be very, very complicated, right? Chicken might be treif. Yeah, okay.
Can you do batal or rav? So if you know that most of the chicken's ancestors were for sure kosher, we have a suffix on the minority.
There is a possibility of bittul, but the only question is when the genetic characteristic of the non-kosher source is manifest and visible in the size or the weight or the color of the animal, there can't be nullification because the non-kosher factor is visible in the final product. Whenever it's visible in the final product, you cannot use bittul barov. That's true for any addition of a non-kosher ingredient. Okay, alrighty. So we now come back to the Heter Mechira, and as I say, the two fundamental issues of the Heter Mechira is: does it allow a Jew to work the land because it belongs to a guy? Number two, what about the prohibition of selling land to a guy? The third, which I dismissed a little bit, is there is not really intention to sell. Okay, so here's my question. All right, I'm a consumer. I'm not a farmer. I'm not cultivating the land. I'm not planting. I'm not plowing. I'm not fertilizing. I'm doing nothing wrong. All I'm doing is eating. I want to eat something. So is there a problem, or what is the problem with my buying something that's labeled Heter Mechira? Meaning, what is the problem from the consumer? I know what the problem is from the farmer, and I even know what the problem is from the rabbinut. The rabbinut's problem is they're not allowed to sell, or possibly they're not allowed to sell the land. And the farmer's problem is he's not allowed to work the land, and it's possibly. Right? So the farmer has a problem, and the rabbinut has a problem. Okay, I understand. But what's my problem? How does that translate in my not eating the finished product? What makes it treif, or does it make it treif? So, potentially, there are three halachic issues on the consumer level that will be relevant to whether I should eat the product or not. Issue number one: if the halacha says the Jewish guy is not supposed to cultivate produce or cultivate the land, even if it's owned by a non-Jew, if you took that strict position, then it turns out all produce that was cultivated by Jews was shamur, meaning it was guarded, it wasn't made hefker, and ne'avad, and it was worked. Now, we did discuss a while ago that there are poskim that say any produce that is produced in violation of the agricultural laws of shemitah becomes like chazer. I'm not allowed to eat it. This is called shamor. Shamor, these are two different violations. Shamor is I didn't make it hefker, I guarded it. Ne'avad means I cultivated it. So, one problem with Heter Mechira is if I don't accept that it permits the farmer to work the land, the produce that I'm getting is shamor and ne'avad. Now, here's the issue. Whether shamor nevad is forbidden is a big machlokas rishonim. But I mentioned that the poskim of Yerushalayim have matered shamor and nevad, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So the fact that the Yid violated shemitah, and therefore the produce is shamor and nevad, is a problem for those who are machmir not to eat shamor v'nevad. But it's not a problem for people who are mekel on shamor v'nevad. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and really the Chachmei Yerushalayim generally, matir shamor v'nevad. So that problem can't be a problem. In other words, number one, maybe like Rav Kook, the farmer could work the land. But even if you're going to say he's not allowed to work the land, the worst that gets you is shamor v'nevad, which is a big machlokas to be sure. And many people, there are people who are machmer on it. But the consensus of most poskim is shamor v'nevad is mutter. So what's my problem? The farmer violated the halacha, okay, but it's shamor v'nevad, I can eat it. Now, problem number 2 is sapichim. Now, sapichim, you'll remember, is a special gezerah d'Rabbanan that applies to grain and vegetables as opposed to fruit. That the Chachamim said, any grain or vegetables that grow on shemitah soil cannot, during shemitah, cannot be eaten at all, right? Totally forbidden, because the Rabbanan were afraid that people would deliberately plant and then claim that it grew by itself. So, if you hold that even if I sell it to a guy, the land still has kedusha, then you may have a special problem with vegetables and grain, even if you matir shomer v'nevad on fruit, but vegetables and grain has an isur sapichim. Can't do it. Right? So that might be a second halachic problem, which would only apply to vegetables, grain, which means bread, cookies, pasta, all of that stuff. But that's not a problem either. Because here is the interesting thing. There is vadai, this is a Mishnah, there is vadai no isur sapichim on non-Jewish land. Even if you take the position that non-Jewish land has an isur of doing avoda, which is the machmir view, there is no isur d'Rabbanan of sapichim on that which grows on non-Jewish land. So you may have to eat it with the holiness of shemitah, if you take the position, but of course the Beis Yosef says no. Right? The Beis Yosef says there's no holiness of shemitah on the peiros, that we already said from the 1500s, and there is no isur sapichim either. So, as a result, so far we haven't really identified what's wrong with my eating Heter Mechira. Even if you reject Rav Kook's premises, and even if you say the Jewish farmer is not allowed to do what he's doing, and even if you say the Rabbanut is not allowed to sell the land and do what they're doing, so they did something wrong, even if you say that. But so what? From my perspective, the worst that it is shamor v'nevad, which many paskin is mutter to eat, and in terms of vegetables and grain, the Mishnah says there is no isur of sapichim on things that grow in a non-Jewish field. So this brings us to the
Sorry, I don't know if I'm missing something.
Yeah.
But I mean, isn't the problem that you say that the land is still Jewish owned, and therefore wouldn't you still have a problem speaking?
Okay, so here's the question. Why do you say that? Why do you say the land is Jewish owned?
Because they don't hold by Rav Kook that you can sell the land.
Okay, so here's the question. All right. So this is a subtlety. You say, I don't hold of Rav Kook. Now, what is it about Rav Kook that I don't hold of? I hold it's prohibited to sell the land, okay? Yes. But here's my question. Even if it's prohibited to sell the land, does that mean the sale ex post facto is invalid? So many would say, yeah, it was a sin to sell the land, but the sale is still a sale, which means in spite of the violation, title is now in the non-Jew. Now, you are correct if you follow the third argument, that this is a fake sale. See, this is where it's at. If you say the fake sale and nobody really means to sell the land, then it would still be Jewish land. And if it would be Jewish land, the Yisr of Sapichim would come into being. But as I say, that's a bit of a specious argument if you accept sale of chametz. So if you're attacking the sale only because it's prohibited, that would not invalidate the sale, and it's still non-Jewish land, and that takes off sapichim. And the only issue you're left with is shamor v'nevad. Shamor v'nevad, we actually paskin as mutter. So this leaves us with one final reason, which is the one surviving reason, and that is, if you reject Rav Kook and you consider the farmer farming the land to be sinful, and you consider the rabbanut selling the land to be sinful, you are not allowed to give financial support to activities that are violating the Torah, violating halacha, whether it's rabbanan or not. This is called mechazek yedei ovrei aveira. Now again, Rav Kook held it wasn't an aveira, but if you're machmer and you don't accept Rav Kook, the bottom line problem why I can't go into a store and buy Heter Mechira stuff is because I am directly or indirectly financially supporting activities that, according to my psak, are not in accordance with the law. Now, this is the basis of why Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach famously paskins that if you are invited as a guest in someone's home and they serve you Heter Mechira produce, you are permitted to eat it. Now, people ask, why should I? Well, if I go to somebody's home and they serve me a piece of pork, am I allowed to eat it? I mean, what type of heter is this, that because I'm a guest in somebody's home, I'm allowed to eat prohibited food? But now I hope you can understand what's going on. If I am not the one who bought it, I am not the one who financially contributed to its acquisition, then there's nothing that I'm doing to support an illegal, non-halachic activity. There's no other reason to answer it. Shomer v'nevad is not a problem because indeed Rav Shlomo Zalman paskins shomer v'nevad is mutter. Sapichim is not a problem because since after the fact the Mechira is valid, there's no issue of sapichim. The only remaining reason why I can't go to the store is because I am mechazek yedei ovrei aveira. That only applies to the financial contributor, right? And therefore, so this is not as serious a problem as we sometimes make it out to be. Part of that is political. Essentially, it means you should not lend financial. I mean, if you're machmer, I mean, if you hold to Rav Kook, there's no problem. And indeed, I'm not telling you not to even. But even if you're machmer and you consider the Heter Mechira illegitimate, even if you delve into it, you will see that essentially it is not a prohibition on eating the food. It is a prohibition on buying the food, because if you're machmir, you are giving support to ovrei aveira. Yeah.
Does land owned by goyim, even though we say, if you're under the opinion that this produce has kedusha, but it's still owned by a goy, does it in return not need shemitah or mesorah to be taken off?
Yes, that's well. Here's the thing. Remember, Lagabi, the produce, we follow Rav Yosef Karo that there is no kedushat shvius, and therefore it does need trumas and mesorahs taken off. In other words, it does not have kedusha, even if the land has kedusha, right? That's Rav Yosef Karo's plan. Yeah.
So if I go to a sandwich shop and assuming the bread's kosher and everything, and it's Heter Mechira, usually all the vegetables are complementary.
Yeah.
So could I eat as many of that as I want?
Well, what about the bread? What about the bread, though? The bread may have the same.
Assuming the bread has a good texture.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. The question is complementary, but you're still paying for a package that includes these things. Maybe it's more of a question. I'm not sure. I mean, I can still see that you're engaged in an economic transaction, which is bringing you these vegetables. So there may be, that's more of a difficult case, I think. Okay, take care.